Hi guys, welcome to the fourth episode of my podcast from Campus of C-Suites. I'm Zuyu, and today I'm here with Ajay Virkar. And he's an entrepreneur, he's a chemical engineer, and now he's the VP at Dupont. So I'll have Ajay talk us through a little bit about himself before we get to the questions.
Okay, well, Diaz, thank you so much for offering to inviting me on your podcast. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, so my name is Ajay Virkar. Me and Zia got connected, I think, mostly because we both were Illinois students. So I did my undergraduate in chemical engineering at Illinois a long, long time ago. And since then, after Illinois, as I said, I went and did my PhD also in chemical engineering, but more focused on material science. And along with my PhD advisor, spun out a company called C3 Nano, which was a advanced materials company, nanotechnology advanced materials company, which was acquired last year by Dupont. And so now I've kind of made the transition from a small startup company to now a much larger company. So yeah, happy to kind of share some of my journey and thoughts and some of the struggles and things that I've learned over the way. So yeah, thanks again, Zia, for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Before we get into all the professional stuff, I mean, we are both U of I students, so let's talk
That's
about
right.
U of I. When did you graduate from U of I?
2005. Again, I know,
Okay.
long time ago.
Back then, like, was the union still under construction? Because that's what it is right now.
Geez, it wasn't, I don't think then. But I just still have the most. I actually was able to come back for maybe about 6 years ago. I came back for a chemical engineering event and I was able to come back through the campus and I had so many fond memories of the union and the quad. It's so awesome. But I don't think it was under construction then. But I think is it still like that was the quad was still like the heart of the whole campus, the
It's
heartbeat,
still
I
the
guess.
heart, but there's so many cranes and scaffolds around. There's always construction going on.
Okay, yeah, for
So,
us, I remember that. So most memorable
ah,
part
man.
probably when I was there was when Illinois' basketball team at that time was awesome. So we had
Oh,
like Pete Brown and Jared Williams. So we were like in the finals. We were super good back then for almost most of the time I was there. So that was really exciting. I remember during the Final Four, like all the games after the games, like the whole campus would sort of come and congregate in the quad. It was like kind of a big party. It was really a lot of fun. So those are some, yeah, magic moments 20 years ago. Yep.
lucky. Hopefully we can recreate that this year.
Yeah, yeah, let's hope so. Yeah.
But yeah, and you moved to Stanford for your graduate school.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what were both of these school experiences like? And did U of I or Stanford specifically, or some experiences specifically, influence the way you thought about science and innovation, especially as a chemical engineer?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, I had a fantastic education at Illinois. I mean, I thought it was just such a great chemical engineering department. I thought the really strong emphasis on, I would say, like the core curricula. And I was super lucky to have really outstanding professors, both in chemical engineering and chemistry and math, almost in everything. I got a whole bunch of names, but certainly one of the ones that stands out is Paul Kennis. So Professor Kennis is where I did my undergraduate research for about 2 years, my junior and senior year, and he was the one who really kind of made me realize my like interest and love for research. And when I was pursuing graduate schools and where to go, he was certainly kind of one of the key people that sort of directed me towards Stanford because I was interested more in the materials, the material science aspect of chemical engineering, where Stanford is kind of well known to have a really strong program and lots of people doing that research. So Paul Kennis was certainly one of the, yeah, still a mentor today and one of the people that's been somebody I've always think about and helpful. Some other fantastic professors, Nancy Meckery in the physical chemistry. I remember she taught some statistical mechanics courses that were still, I think, transformative. I had some Lynn Belford, also in the chemistry department. He passed away a few years ago. He taught me quantum mechanics. I still think about him all the time. But yeah, I just had a fantastic experience. I thought Illinois prepared me super well for graduate studies and really took the time I thought to focus on key curricula in a really good and interesting way. And then at Stanford, Stanford also was, of course, had a great experience. It was a little bit different because it was on the quarter system. So in terms of like classes and things, it was kind of a big shift for me actually. So in some ways, I like quarters because if you don't like a class, it goes by faster. But in some of the courses, also, it feels like you're packing a whole semester's worth of information
Yeah.
sometimes into a quarter. But at the same time, yeah, you were able to experience and take a lot of different courses. So as a graduate student, that was kind of nice, as I was able to sample lots of different departments and that. So that was kind of a cool aspect of it. And of course, Stanford is a great place for innovation, lots of interdisciplinary research and activity. very closely connected to things like fundraising and venture capital, communities and innovation, entrepreneurship. It's still really strong in those things. So that was also, I think, a really cool thing that I was able to experience at Stanford.
Yeah, awesome. Now, one thing that really strikes me is you're always really passionate about chemistry and chemical engineering. Like hearing you talk makes me realize that like you think this is genuinely fun. So, I agree. This is chemical engineering is fun, but
That's true.
but do you have any like quick
Took a
advice
long time to
for?
get there. Actually, like, no.
Yeah, I mean,
So yeah,
but
no, that's a great question. I don't know if I enjoyed it as much when I was going through it, to be honest with you. A lot of it is like retrospectively thinking about, oh, that's so cool how that ties back to, other things. And I think what's so powerful about, well, chemical engineering or the physical sciences in general is like it literally ties to so many things in the world, right? You can think about how so many things work based on some of these principles. Well, I thought that is well, that, physics, it's just so powerful when you think about how all these, yeah, interesting things work and how they work. And so I really, yeah, that's why I think I'm so interested in it. I'm always trying to understand how something sort of works. And I think engineering gives you that issue. But don't get me wrong. There's certainly things I didn't like, and there's certainly I know the struggle, and it's certainly a hard major, and that everybody struggles. So th those were true to everybody. But yeah, I think more and more as I grew older, I started getting more interested or connecting some dots from different areas and different fields where I thought chemical engineering in particular gives you a lot of ability to do those things.
no. Hopefully, I get through the rough patch that I'm in right now for chemical engineering. But I agree.
You're already doing great. So
It's really interesting to think about because it's so connected to everything, like everything we see in the regular day life. But yeah, I thought that I could move on and start talking about, you went to Stanford and you spun a startup out of your grad school experience. So it's called See Through Nano, right?
Mhm.
And you guys do
Yes.
like deep tech materials. I think don't quote me on this, but it's like
Mhm.
ink and films for various applications. And so you've done R&D, you've done the pitching and fundraising, and now you've done selling, you selling to customers, and now you've sold it to Dupont. So
Mhm.
throughout all this process, like, walk us through more of the details and what did you find as, the most memorable moments of being an entrepreneur?
Okay, that's a really interesting, good question. Yeah, so I mentioned when I went to Stanford, I worked with Professor Zhenin Bao. So she's still a professor at chemical engineering. She's world famous when it comes to novel electronic materials. So I kind of broadly her research theme has been developing kind of new electronic materials for all sorts of applications. So when I was there, we were looking a lot at, transistors, which are the basic building block, right, of circuitry or electronics. And so we were trying to figure out new compounds. So, typically you think about things like silicon being the most important semiconducting material, but actually you can make semiconductors out of materials that are like plastic, so polymers and small molecule organic materials, right? So that's an area where she was really a pioneer. And so at that time, we were doing a lot of those kind of work and also looking at other adjacent materials, things that were other conductive materials made of polymers or carbon nanotubes or, other nanotechnologies and materials. And so the company sort of spun out where her and I and a postdoc at the time had some new ideas about how to make these special materials called transparent conductors. So that sort of sounds like an oxymoron because if you think about something typically that's transparent, it's not electrically conductive, and vice versa, right? Something like take a piece of aluminum foil, it's super electrically conductive, it's not at all transparent. Or a piece of glass, super optically transparent, not at all electrically conductive. But there's special ways to try to make these kinds of materials, and so we developed some novel ways to create this kind of class of materials. And it's a really interesting material because it's a really ubiquitous material. You find it in every display, every touch sensor, every phone. So we always used to say that you spend 6 or 7 of your hours of your life looking at a transparent conductor, whether it's a TV screen or your iPhone or your laptop. So these are really important materials for electronics. They're also super important for things like solar cells. So all solar cells require a transparent conductor, again, something that lets light in, but able to extract the electricity generated out. It's useful in things like smart windows. It's really so these materials are kind of all over the place. But the incumbent material had a problem or has a problem that it's fundamentally rigid. So it's a sputtered material. It's called indium tin oxide. That's kind of the dominant transparent conductor. I won't go into too many details, but basically you can think of it like a ceramic. So that material it's got really good balance of these properties, transparency and electrical conductivity, but it's like fundamentally brittle. And so if you think about a lot of applications where you may want something to be, flexible or in a new form factor, or maybe deposited at very low temperature, Those are all things where that material struggled at. And so we saw an opportunity with some of the materials that we developed that we could, either get to new applications or address new markets by developing this new material. So we spun the company out, and at that time we were, as I mentioned, solar is a big opportunity for transparent conductors. So we actually did some student-run um, what do they call business plan competitions. So one of the famous ones is the MIT Clean Energy Prize, which I think is that was already a couple of years old when we did it. Now it's been, I think, running successfully for since then. This is around 2010. And also Rice, has a really famous Rice business plan competition. So we also participated in those, and we ended up winning a kind of a NASA prize at Rice, and then we won the whole first prize at the MIT Clean Energy. And so this was at a time where, kind of was thinking, should we start a company? Should we? I was actually thinking at that time in my career, mostly thinking about going into academia. So I had like already drafted some postdoc applications and was thinking about what to do. But then we decided it was, we're getting a lot of interesting traction. And so then we thought, it's a kind of, I thought, a once in a lifetime opportunity to start a company. So got, of course, very good support from Jinan. And at that time, also, we were able to find a really seasoned CEO who came from the industry. He's also a close friend and mentor of mine, Cliff Morris. So then, we had this relatively small team, or three or four of us, that started sort of going out and trying to build the company. And it was once we started launching the company and fundraising and all those kind of things, where we also realized where solar is always a very interesting application, but the nearer term application and the application was getting a lot more draw from real commercial interest was around consumer electronics. So then we really started focusing on how to develop these materials for consumer electronics applications. Yeah, so then we really built the company from three or four up to I think at the max we were maybe 70-ish people. We had operations in the US. So we had two facilities in Hayward, California, which is in close to Oakland is probably the nearest big city, but it's kind of an industrial city in Silicon Valley, heavily focused on manufacturing and there's a lot of biotech and material startups out there. Very conducive for that. Then we also had a facility in Korea, so a couple hours away from Seoul. And also then around 2017 or 18, we set up a large manufacturing facility in China, about 2 hours away from Shanghai. So because we were so consumer electronics sort of focused, we had to have a strong presence, of course, in Asia, which is, I would say, Silicon Valley and, Japan, parts of China and parts of Korea and Taiwan. Those are like the epicenter sort of all these electronic materials. So we had to have presences over there. So walking through that. Yeah. So then we ended up really focusing on four major areas for this material. So I talked about consumer electronics, but beyond that, we also found interesting application in the automotive sector, which we're still working on and pursuing today as part of Dupont. And then in things like clean tech, and so I mentioned solar. So we did a lot of work actually with solar companies and on smart windows. And then finally also in biotech. So we have interesting, because our material has these useful properties of being, flexible and stretchable, things you want to be, for example, more compatible with the human body. We also had a lot of programs related to like electronic biomedical devices and applications. Um, yeah, so then we kept on basically running the company, and I would say when you said most memorable moments, I would say one of the most memorable moments was probably when we got our first like big order. So at that time, Hitachi Chemical, the famous chemical company in Japan, they actually changed their name recently, but I'll go through that. They purchased a big order of material from us, like several hundred kilograms of ink, or the conductive ink product that you were mentioning, that would be coated out to make these transparent conductive films. And so I remember our CEO and I were on a train together in Japan, and we were kind of high-fiving each other, and we were so excited because it was our first like real order from a real big customer. And Hitachi Chemical ended up being the first company that was actually able to launch a product together in the consumer electronics space. So we made some cool, flexible, wearable devices through them. So that was a really memorable moment for sure. And then I'd say the other, lots of memorable moments, of course, for this many years, but the other really memorable moment is when, later on when we were able to actually get our material also qualified into kind of a household cell phone. So now our materials in hundreds of millions of smartphones, maybe even in your pocket today. So that was another really big kind of milestone for us. It was certainly memorable when we kind of all connected the dots and found out, oh wow, our material's going into that product. So that was really cool. Um, but most memorable of the whole thing has really been, yeah, just the relationships and the people. So we've met a lot of fantastic people I've been lucky to meet or to work with at C3 Nano, at a bunch of the other companies that I met. that's been really fun, traveling around to all sorts of parts of the world, Asia, Europe, and meeting all sorts of cool people. So that's also been certainly super memorable.
Awesome. I'm actually really curious because this is kind of off script, but judging by what you mentioned, like this already came from almost like a passion project, kind of a because you thought it was fun, right? Or because you thought it was promising. So a lot of entrepreneurs tell me that if you're starting a company, you should identify like a market niche, like it's market driven, it should be needs driven. But I feel like you guys kind of started with like a product in mind and then push to find the various paths that it can be taken to market. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. So how like do you see a benefit in doing that, or is there like a separate dynamic then for this approach than like the other one?
Yeah, maybe I did do a great job explaining. Maybe I try again. So the material we knew, this transparent conductor, we knew was like a super interesting material, but we were not by no means the research we were starting to do. We were trying to make better solar cells. That was our objective.
Okay.
Um, but when we started taking our material and then we started sending it to like other companies that were testing solar cells, and we filed a patent and we were at Stanford and said, okay, we think it's interesting technology. Um, but at that time, we were getting then we got super interesting feedback, and people said, oh wow, this is a really promising material. So we sort of realized already there was interest in this material for sure. We didn't, yeah, again, we never started the idea. We didn't do the research to start a company by any means, but when we spun out and said, hey, we're getting a lot of interesting customer feedback and people are interested in this material. There could be some really useful things this material does that doesn't exist maybe. And so that's what kind of drove us more. But yeah, it wasn't like a plan, I would say, by any means. But then when we did these business plan competitions and started saying, oh yeah, there's lots more interest of, this material maybe, and maybe other applications. Um, but when we started really going through deeper to really develop a business plan and understand what markets, the venture capitalists got more involved and we hired a CEO, that's when we really started, I would say, honing in on taking what we thought is a interesting material and then really finding which is the best application to target first. And that's kind of how we then ran. And then after that, it was I would say, very a little strategic as you can be as a startup, but really then thinking what are the right customers or partners? What's the right entry point? Where do we want to, yeah, partnerships in these kind of, especially in consumer electronics, become very critical because it takes a lot of material to go from a material supplier to, let's say, a cell phone. There's, dozens of companies sort of in between these two. So picking the right companies. And that came with, luckily, I would say, my CEO had a lot of experience doing business in this particular area. Jinan and myself luckily had a lot of contacts from like Japan in particular, where there's lots of work in advanced materials. I would say the mostly kind of advanced, one of the epicenters really of advanced materials, especially for electronics, is in Japan. And I had a lot of friends there. Jinan had a ton of contacts. She's a famous professor with doing this area, so that also helped us. And my CEO also had a lot of connections in Japan. So yeah, so later we got home down and we started kind of then we developed this sort of strategy of working to meet a spec the highest tier that goes into the best products. And we realized if we could do that, then we would have a lot of other opportunities to utilize the material. But yeah, maybe I misspoke in the first sense. Yeah, it wasn't, I would say, yeah, we weren't nearly as, I think, as disciplined as I'm looking at younger entrepreneurs like yourself and others who've already really thought it detailed. We weren't that detailed at thinking about it. But we had a kind of a plan, but certainly we were passionate about what we thought the technology could do and the different places it could be applied. And for me in particular, I was always really hoping we could do something in solar because I'm very interested in solar technology and that. But unfortunately, we did a lot of kind of proto work and never went really to production yet. Still some challenges, but I'm still hopeful that there might be some interesting application in the future for this technology and some of the new solar technologies that are being developed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can just lead off that tangent. I think you advised the Department of Energy on one of the solar projects. So, if you could tell us more about that one, if it's relevant to the
Yeah.
technology that C3 Nano did, or is like a separate
Yes.
technology in general?
Uh, yeah, kind of. So I was approached a few years ago, actually by this consortium. I forget the exact name. But it was kind of some venture capital folks and funding investors and the Department of Energy. They kind of put together this sort of program about trying to figure out how to develop perovskite. So that's a particular type of solar technology in the
Mm.
U.S. And so I was joined as like an advisor for this Made in America solar perovskite. And so there, the idea of this program, it's a great program where the DOE will basically fund a variety of startups that they can be anywhere from coming in academics or even, just a bunch of people that have a good idea and some good technology in the perovskite space and trying to figure out how to hopefully figure out how to manufacture. A lot of people in the solar industry think that's really the next big leap. The next, that semiconducting material is going to really be the next big um, next generation of solar. There's lots of advantages over like conventional silicon in terms of manufacturing costs and materials availability, temperature, lots of different things. But there's lots of technical challenges to also be solved. And so that's how I got involved in that. So they were looking for people with expertise in, scaling advanced materials. And of course, these materials are already adjacent to things in solar. So I have some experience in solar, but mostly they were looking to, and then, yeah, fundraising and developing business plans around advanced materials. And the kind of this word is used a lot in our industry. They call it roll to roll, or which is basically means that it's a way to manufacture everything kind of from solution, like a newspaper press works, but really quickly. So imagine you put in a big roll of plastic, for example, then you have a bunch of functional inks or functional components that end up being basically deposited, and you end up with the final component. So that's kind of one of the dreams for something like a solar cell. Is I put in a roll of kind of just, let's say, a big roll of plastic, like a big roll of PET or something. I put a whole bunch of layers on it, and I get ultimately, a functional a solar cell out. And of course, versus something like current methods of developing high temperature vacuum much slower. So there's lots of economies of scale and lots of ways to get potentially very cheap solar at really high volumes. If all these, but again, tons of technological challenges. But roll to roll is the way we deposited a lot of our materials. So making, conductive layers of these conductive rolls of these materials, which we would then sell to our partners or customers. And that's the reason. So a lot of these technologies for them to become commercially viable, of course, the manufacturing piece is super critical. And so I did have quite a bit of work, or I mean, accompanied a lot of work on roll-to-roll manufacturing and how to scale up some of those materials.
Okay. And then I kind of want to circle back onto the previous talk about like your work with especially cell phones and the consumer electronics. I
Hmm.
did a quick search just in a couple of seconds. Turns out there's like 1.2 billion to 1.5 billion cell phones made every single year. So
That's a lot.
so one of the things that I've noticed in academia is that it takes a while for research to get traction. It takes a while for papers to get published and for technology to get developed.
Hmm.
So for you guys, it's a very technical material, but for the cell phone industry, it's an extremely rapid, fast-moving. I think they call it sales cycle. So have you ever faced the problem where the R&D cycle was too long to keep up with the sales cycle of like consumer electronics?
That's a great question. And yes, I mean, I don't know. I've been working in several industries. I think consumer electronics is known to be very brutal, very cutthroat, very much, yeah, like you mentioned, it's very much time driven, right? So just take a cell phone manufacturer, just let's say Huawei, for example, right? So Huawei has a plan for maybe next year, the year after, maybe a 5-year plan, but they already know exactly, they're working at a very tight, like month by month, week by week sort of schedule to make sure they're implementing the technologies. And so the way these big companies often will work was they might be running 3 or 4 technologies in parallel. So let's say they want a new feature, let's just say a new camera, for example. And there's a bunch of different components that go into a new camera, right? So they would be working with a bunch of their suppliers, their internal engineering team, a variety of different groups inside, and they would be then working out with these partner companies, and they would be trying to kind of intercept. So when is the technology ready and completely qualified? When is have you done address all the reliability issues, all the performance issues, all the cost issues? So in parallel, these materials companies or suppliers will be working with their procurement groups, like the business groups, to try to say, okay, are we meeting the cost targets? There'll be other people saying, can we meet all the scale? You got to make, let's say, 100 million units. Can they do that? So in addition to having, yeah, all the R&D sort of, so the R&D would be often maybe many years ahead. So you might be thinking about, we want to launch this in a Huawei product in 3 or 4 years. That R&D could start now, for example, right? So we will be talking to them. Okay, this is a new feature they want to do. They have a whole bunch of engineers and scientists who will be scoping out components and materials. And then it is very much like there's an analogy they use a lot in our industry about, kind of catching this at the right time, catching the right plane or catching the right train. It's got to be the technology, everything has to meet. And sometimes you miss that cycle. Yeah, you have to wait a whole other year. And by the time that year comes, there might be other changes or different focuses. So many times in our life, we would have all the qualifications were done, technology we thought was ready, we met the cost targets, but for whatever reason, they decide not to go with this technology or not implement this feature. Or at the end of the day, like you said, we often would have, oh, 8 out of the 9 specs we met, but one reliability spec we just can't meet. Or they decide to put a new layer on top of our material that ends up destroying our material's performance. So That's a lot of the challenges. That's why the design, yeah, it takes a long time to get designed in. The nice thing is once you get designed in, usually there's a good like stickiness where you end up staying for quite some time unless a lot of other things move out. But yeah, that is a huge challenge in terms of consumer electronics, which is why it's actually very challenging for startups in particular to supply this industry because it's like a lot of it's just a kind of a coin flip and luck. Can you survive long enough to get your product to meet the right timeline and meet everything else? And usually working with other big companies that have a bunch of other infrastructure and adjacent technologies to work. But no, you're exactly right. It is a super competitive, difficult market because of that. And then so the volumes are huge, the timelines are super tight. Um, Companies, yeah, don't want to take a risk on anything, right? So they're risk
Yeah.
averse, makes sense. So all those combine to make it a very challenging material sort of problem to launch into.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that there are similar issues in clean tech and biotech and the other fields that you worked in, or I'd imagine those have like more, they're not as cutthroat and not as high volume as
Yeah,
consumer electronics.
I think by volume wise and speed of change, at least in my experience, I would say consumer electronics is the fastest for sure. So with automotive, getting more and more experience in that space too. So automotive is certainly, I would say, more conservative, and they kind of have to be for a bunch of reasons. Like one is reliability is even much more challenging, right? My cell phone might last a year, or 3 or 4 years, and there's different ways to actually accelerate testing to make sure you can test to these specs. But for a car, you want the thing to be running for 20 years, which is the components, so it's much more rigid to make the materials and the components more stable. So that's kind of one kind of fundamental challenge. And of course, you want things in a car to be much more safe. They have to be safer, right? These are critical things. So that's why I'd say that in a sense a little bit slower, but and also very sticky. So once you get a component in, then it usually can last for a super long time. But one thing that's happened recently, as this change from traditional combustion engine or combustion cars to EV, things like the design cycle and some of those things are actually changing much more rapidly. In the reason for that, kind of at a high level, is if you think about 10 years, 20 years ago, and there wasn't any EV cars, there's a lot of differentiation in a car based on its combustion engine, right? I can get a super fancy V8, lots of, super expensive, complicated engine. Or I could get a much cheaper car, maybe a V4 that's much simpler and cheaper. And so so if I'm a consumer, I can look at the two different cars and they look very different. So if I gotta really want to pay the money, I can do it. At an EV car, in some sense, they're a lot simpler. I mean, you have to have a really good battery pack, but a lot of the other things have been sort of, in some sense, simplified, though. And so now a lot of what are the other features you can add to a car? Of course, like the ADAS systems, the AI, all those other things. So now, in that sense, there's a lot of drive from the EV companies to add new features to also help differentiate cars and car models. At least that's something I've thought of. I'm not 100% sure that's all accurate, but that's where I keep on seeing it or thinking about it. And so because of that, they're looking for new, cool, interesting features that could rely on new materials. But these materials, again, may not be critical for like a reliability or safety, but maybe they're different. They want the dashboard to look different, and they want maybe a special little display that shows up. So that's how some of the trends in terms of automotive are changing a little bit. But by and large, you're right. And then in terms of biotech or medical, we did have a lot of super interesting projects. But yeah, theirs are even, they got a whole other set of compliance and regulatory issues, right? Of course they have to and they should, right, in order to make sure what you're doing is, safe to either put in the body or buy the body. So in those instances, being, a small company and not having those expertise at all, we really relied then on our partners. So we would be working with a big company that knew how to do all those things, and we'd be supplying our material. They'd be telling us kind of the bare minimum stuff we need to get right, and they'd figure out the other ways to do those things. But the way you thought about it, I think overall, I think about it the same way. That there's these are some of the big differences in these big macro areas. Sorry, and then last one, clean tech. Yeah, clean tech too. Same thing. Reliability being a critical thing, right? Especially like a solar. You want these solars to last for 20, 30 years. You need to understand the depreciation and the cost and how to model the finances 10 or 15 years from now. So you need to know if my solar cell, for example, is 20% efficient today, what is it 10 years from now? Because that's going to be very critical to understand how much it's really valued at, all those kind of things. So it's an even a more kind of complicated problem, and because of that, reliability and performance are even more difficult. And so the testing cycles, and we worked with solar companies before where they'd make a set of solar cells and it would take an entire year to do the testing. So they put it in a chamber, they'd take it out a year. So I mean, this really means how wow, that's so if you got to make a change, you got to almost wait another year to do the same testing cycle again. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like your analogy from before. It's like catching the right train, right? Catching
Yeah,
the
yeah.
right plane, catching the right
Yes,
train.
yes.
So, one thing that I've noticed is you guys have this phenomenal material, and because of, just the vast amount of applications that you can get from this material, you're able to almost like hop on many different trains, and that's why you're working in many different fields.
Mhm.
So, what would you say, where do you see innovation in nanotechnology, materials, or chemical engineering in general? What would you say the next train in this space is?
Oh, wow, that's a very good, difficult question. So I would say, so I think there's a lot of, as it won't be surprising to say that, everybody believes a lot in this AI hype AI cycle, right? So AI, of course, is going to be a critical technology. How whether it's a bubble, whether all the things are going to happen, I think time will sort of tell. But regardless, more compute, more computational power, more ability to do more complicated things in terms of all these AI models, all the things. So what people often, and you look at a company like NVIDIA, like, this phenomenal chip company, incredible technology. What people don't always think about is those are all built by materials,
Hmm.
right? In order for the NVIDIA chip to work or, TSMC to work, they got to have the right set of materials to do that. And so there's a lot of innovation that's happening to try to help, you know, continue to push the boundaries of what can be done, on a chip, for example. So there's lots of people working on, yeah, different materials, different ways to further push those boundaries. So people talk about, for example, smaller and smaller transistors. And that means you're going to have to get, new materials to probably do some of those things. People talk about how to make a chip with, now people are I just saw an article today that people are saying they're going to go, there's a roadmap to go to zero point 0.2 nanometer transistors. Something sounds crazy using totally new materials. And that also means new photoresists, new photo technology, no, new lithography technology. So all those require lots of materials. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, or that there's a lot of research and development going on there. Also on the other side, you see all these data banks and centers and all this. One of the other big challenges is, heat dissipation, getting these chips to run, more efficiently and cooler so that you can actually, run them more efficiently. So there's lots of interesting work that's going on in thermal management and how to, what new materials and what new chemistries can be applied to try to improve the fundamental hardware. I could see as another big area. Quantum computing stuff, lots of stuff in quantum computing too, lots of material science and material challenges where I could see a lot of, there's lots of interesting things, of course, happening. The other one also, people are talking about beyond electronic circuits, people are talking a lot about photonic circuits, so using light versus, electrons. So again, tons of materials related challenges. How do you design waveguides and interconnects and the right refractive index material? So there's a lot. And then, of course, energy, right? As a big picture, there's always stuff in energy. So catalysis, and can we, figure out ways to generate more energy, generate it cheaper, cleaner, better. So in many ways, all the big things. And I really don't have enough experience or expertise to talk about things in like the biomaterials, biomedical. But of course, there's tons of things there. Renewable, I mean, plastic, circular economy stuff. Can you really develop plastics that can be, you know, infinitely recyclable from biological bioprocess sources? So I think there's always new opportunities, I guess. But in terms of I guess top of my mind, I would say things in the AI and like energy are two places where at least I'm hearing a lot of buzz in those areas.
Awesome. Okay, that's a lot of planes that we can hop on.
Yes, that's
But yeah, there's a lot of questions I had on entrepreneurship, but I want to move into you're currently VP at Dupont. So that's a very different type of organization, right? DuPont's much bigger. So what is your time at Dupont like? I'd imagine for a larger company, it's very hard to get new products out. But maybe for Dupont is different. Maybe for your department, perhaps like innovation is more of a bigger theme. So yeah, just tell us about your experience there.
okay. Yeah, so DuPont is actually going through a really interesting split right now. So the company actually DuPont is splitting. Actually, it's happening on the first, so 2 days from now, technically.
Oh.
And it's going to be splitting off. So, DuPont is, historically this huge chemical company, does a lot of different things. So people, DuPont does a lot of things, let's say in water filtration, lots of advanced materials, lots of polymers, lots of stuff for aviation, basically everything you imagine DuPont does. But people don't necessarily know DuPont about as much as their electronics group. So DuPont, I mentioned like a lot of these big chip makers, a lot of these materials come from DuPont. So DuPont supplies a ton of materials into like if you look at a smartphone or look at a computer, a lot of those materials are actually coming from DuPont. And so I guess for the last several years, the board of directors and everybody has decided to actually split the company into two. So one will be, let's say, kind of more traditional heritage, so adhesives, biomedical technologies, water filtration. That'll remain Dupont, and they're spinning off this new company called Qnity, Qnity, to really focus on electronic materials. And that's a part of the organization that I'm going to be part of, and all my colleagues from C3 Nano and all the people I work with at DuPont. Um, and really, the idea there is because I mentioned a lot of these, opportunities in things like AI and all these new opportunities in materials to power the next generation of electronics. They wanted to, have a kind of focused, dedicated company to work on these. And, as a slightly smaller company, still it's going to be about 10,000 people, so still a large company. It's going to be like one of, if not the world's largest pure play electronic materials company. So one of the largest focus really on these. So yeah, so it's been interesting to see what the kind of split. So we're going to be a little bit smaller, but still part of a big company. I do think that one nice thing about just I think catching this sort of ocean or this wave of AI has been interesting, right? From up to the highest level leadership at our company, there's lots of excitement around what could be done, with this new company in this space. So that's quite interesting. One nice thing about being part of a big company is, there's so many different technologies and so many different experts in different areas. So one cool thing on the innovation side is, there's some problems, like let's say some interesting problems about our technology we could never solve. Like we didn't have the analytical technologies, we didn't have the experts in these particular spaces, but some of those actually made a ton of progress once we joined a big company because there are people that get ex to do those things. Some of the other processes that, we were doing, maybe not the safest way, not the most manual, not the most, let's say, ergonomic way. Some of these things, now DuPont's already come in and made big improvements to some of those processes, right? Because they do things in a more structured way than a startup sort of does. But I think about things, they got experts kind of for everything. And so that part has been a nice way. Certainly, I don't think innovation, it's always, I think, hard for, that's the advantage of the little companies, always going to be more innovative. They kind of can take more risks. They do things faster. Those are always the things. But the downside, but compared to a big company is, yeah, they have to take a much shorter view. So one nice thing about being a big company, I know I look at how DuPont looks at some of these problems, and they might be working on things or community, that may not materialize for several years out, but they realize where the trends are going in AI. They realize what kind of materials are going to be utilized maybe 5 years from now, 7 years from now, and they already have programs that are thinking about how to work on those, right? Which is something that a small company really never has the time to look out that kind of horizon. Yeah, so it's sort of a balance.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've talked about your experience in startups, in academia, in bigger companies, and in advising the government. So, a lot of these perspectives, do you think, for leadership and growth and innovation, do you see a lot of common themes, or do you think there's still a big disconnect, between these various fields? Because my belief is that, like, if we want to make progress, especially in something like energy, which is fundamentally a very infrastructural thing, we
Mhm.
need more unity and collaboration. So I guess this question divides into two parts. The first part is, do you think these four sectors that you've worked with are very well connected, or do you think there's still disconnects? And then the second part is, as someone who's worked in all four sectors, like, would you say the style of leadership, the style of work is very similar, or are there things that, like don't really translate well from one area to another?
Well, that's a great, interesting question. So I guess I would say, answering the first question, I think everybody would hope that you'd get better, no matter where you're at, you hope you get better collaboration between all these,
Mhm.
right? Of course, academia is a place where I would say, the most innovative, the stuff that you're not supposed to be trying to start a company academia. You're supposed to be doing fundamental, good, interesting research that can change, really make a fundamental change to the paradigm, right? That's academia. I mean, in my view, that's its goal. Um, Small and larger companies are really have to figure out how to take technologies and make them, valuable for society. And sometimes, again, with a startup, it's a little bit more, risky. It's a little bit more, I would say, cutting edge. It's at the poker table. It's putting all your chips in a lot of times, and it's a big roller coaster. Big companies, it's have to have a longer view, have to do things in a more structured way because that's the way they operate and gain long-term stability and success. And then the government, I don't have, like I said, I would say this project I've had, it's been a lot of fun. So I wouldn't necessarily really call myself an expert. But I do like the idea of, more partnership is really good, right? Then, if everybody realizes there's strong there's strong support from a government that these are the directions they want to go. It helps everybody sort of align and know, right? I mean, I like this, for example, the Solar Initiative Prize. It was cool in the sense that, all right, here's a big organization within the government that's saying, look, we've looked at all the different solar technologies. For these reasons, we believe perovskite is a right place to, put a bet on, put some money on. So that helps incentivize academic researchers, small companies, even big companies to say, hey, we'll put some resources around this because now we realize there's, support for this, there's ways to do it. So yeah, I think the more that happens, the better it helps drive technology. And I've seen some really cool technologies that come out of this prize and this out of this the startup work here. I'm, helping a startup that's doing some really fantastic things that came out of this prize. I could see them, making some real inroads into the perovskite space, and I think this whole thing was helpful for them as a structural way to sort of do it.
Yeah. Okay. I thought I could move into some more fun questions because you did mention
Okay.
that for C3 Nano, some of the processes that you did are not as safe or
Yeah.
ergonomic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're all chemistry students. Even
Mhm.
though I've only been in the lab for a couple of years, I've had my fair share of oopsies.
Yep.
What was your most memorable, mess up?
Oh, I've had
Or-
several. So I guess I can maybe start with one of my first was this was probably like my second or third week maybe as a graduate student. I was at Stanford and I was in lab and I spilled a huge bottle of MEK, methyl
oh
ketone.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like an acetone. So, and it just ate a whole bunch of the floor, like because it just dissolved
Oh.
all the adhesive underneath there. And I remember like, oh, it was just a huge mistake. So I thought my advisor was gonna be so mad at me, but she's a trained chemist for so many years. She has so much experience. So she told me not to do it again, obviously, but she understood because this is sort of the things that sort of happen. So I remember that being one. And also in my first like year or so, this wasn't my oopsie, but I was at lab pretty late, like 9 or 10 at night, and just me and somebody else was there and somebody forgot to change the tank on the glove box, and so the negative pressure caused the glove box to basically suck in the gloves and start expanding, and they were going to basically we thought basically explode. So there was no pressure in that. It was a big vacuum inside the glove box. So I had to quickly run with him and change the tank. So I just remember being super scared because it's like, what's going to happen? Is this whole glove box going to just explode? So I remember chemicals would go everywhere, but luckily we solved that problem. And what other? Oh, another time I this is a big mess up is I accidentally hit a switch. I was actually doing a tour with some other people, and there was a colleague of mine was running a big, huge chemical synthesis reaction, and I told him, hey, I need to do a tour and stuff like that. And I was somehow a conversation came up, and I pressed a button, not thinking anything would happen, to just explain something. Ended up something happened. A whole bunch of I basically totally turned off the um what was I gonna say? I completely basically shut off his reaction in mid-process and ruined a whole big batch. So I felt totally terrible about that. So yeah. So I've had many oopsies, but yeah.
Yeah, glad to know you're still safe.
Yeah, yeah. It's safe. But safe, yeah, made a lot of oopsies, yep.
Yeah. And then last time we talked, you showed me a textbook, I think, on thermodynamics. So
Mm.
one thing I got from our conversation is that you're like a very passionate lifelong learner. So outside of just in everything that you've learned, it could be, technical details or like just random facts about the world. What do you think is the most interesting thing, like and out of every single thing that you've read?
That's an almost impossible question. But let me see. I do think there's a lot of, I think it's super interesting if you're like a scientist or an engineer to really study things like the humanities or totally different
Mhm.
areas. So, like, for example, I really love philosophy. I like history a lot. And I think you can see interesting parallels between things in like fundamental sciences and even those. There's lots of interesting corollaries. I mean, back a couple hundred years ago, people didn't distinguish philosophy from, let's say, physics. They're all called natural
Yeah.
philosophers. I mean, look at Newton and Einstein. And that's kind of gotten lost right now. And I feel like, especially, I'm going off a tangent here, but I feel like a lot of stuff about AI that's happening, right? A lot of people are talking a lot about AI. But I don't hear almost any of the people that are really talking to like AI, like the CEOs of these companies, almost none of them are talking about a lot of the philosophical questions about what does it mean to be intelligent? What does it mean to be, what's empirical knowledge versus analytical knowledge? A lot of these things that actually, I would say 16th, 17th, even actually back to ancient Greece, these are things philosophers have been challenging it across the world. And Asian philosophers, African philosophers, European philosophers have been thinking about these things for generations. But none of that has sort of moved in. So I do feel there's this big disconnect. And I think there's lots of value to thinking about problems from a totally different ways and trying to understand connectivity between all these things. So that's an interesting fact, but I keep on getting interesting to see how many areas from one topic or subject will totally show up in another. I think, Leno, I mentioned to you like that. I think I mentioned somebody before, but um, if you look at like all the underlying math and physics that goes into a large language model, all the AI, it's built 100% on thermodynamics. I mean, it's basically a problem where you are searching for the lowest energy minima. You are basically treating enthalpy and entropy in ways about structure and information and how they're being organized. So you can almost think about all the equations. I mean, even the equations are basically really they're just complete analogs of what you look at like in a very complicated thermodynamic system. Particles moving around has this complete analogy to like information and information systems and putting words in order. So there's like two things you never thought would be totally related. The stock market, similar. Like a lot of people are modeling stock markets about entropy maximization, and the math looks very, very similar to thermodynamics, and how things are moving looks a lot like kinetics. So it's like places you never think that are at all related end up having some very interesting fundamental relationships, which I always think is like super fascinating. That's probably the most one of those interesting things to me is just whenever you find these weird connections about things you think are not at all related and they become related, that becomes really interesting and powerful.
Wow. Okay, maybe I'll pay more attention in my thermodynamics class.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, no, I actually never thought about any of that way. So, would you have like a book that you would recommend that people can get into, or like some articles you can read?
Oh, that's a good question. Geez, a couple good books. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. Okay, one really good history book, one of the best, is called The Dawn of Everything by David Gerber and David Wengrow. That's a fantastic, kind of totally new history book, but puts things in it. It's kind of history that nobody really learns, but they've studied it and thought about it really well. On a more of a science, I guess, related or very interesting book if you're interested in kind of quantum mechanics and the history of quantum mechanics, which is like a super interesting. It's called Quantum by Manjeet Kumar. That's one of the best books. I'm just looking at my shelf for that I've ever read. And let me think. Oh, and then if you interesting about philosophy and after philosophy, if you ever read Will Durant's there's like the history or the story of philosophy. That's also a really good one. It kind of covers broadly, mostly Western philosophy, but from the beginning to the end in like short snippets and just kind of shows the continuity of thought and how people were thinking. Like, those are maybe three I could just kind of think about looking at my bookshelf here, but those would be,
Awesome.
yeah.
I check those out.
Okay.
But yeah, I wanted to get to like the end part of our podcast and start asking some questions about like general advice and start summarizing. So you have been an entrepreneur, and you currently advise a lot of startups. So you're acting as a mentor for a lot of people, students like me as well. So what is one piece of advice that you constantly share is the most important thing that you would give to young aspiring leaders like me and everyone who's listening?
Oh. Gee, that's a tough question. I'll probably have to rely on my mentors to think of what I've learned from them. But I think one thing is, yeah, try to find something you're truly passionate about and do something you're passionate about. So that's really like critical. And I think the other big thing is, your integrity and the way you treat people and being honest, like some of those things will kind of always pay dividends. People will always remember those sort of things. So those are like critical. People often talk about screwing over people in business. Those kind of things I think never work. Actually, I found the people that have become, done really well are people that are typically, have these, important character traits of like integrity, honesty, those kind of things end up being really critical no matter what you do. So like that, being passionate and finding something you really like to do, and yeah, respecting other people a lot too. I mean, you're gonna meet lots of people with different points of view, different places of the world, different sort of things. So I think that's one other. I was so lucky to meet so many fascinating people, learn a lot from them. So I think be open-minded to some of those things.
Yeah, of course. And then I'm actually curious, you kind of answered this before, but you didn't expect to be an entrepreneur, right? When you were my age, or even if you were in grad school, like you didn't expect to be an entrepreneur later on through your career. So how did you adapt, like personally, like the skill sets that you've built, or like changes to your personal life? Because it's a big shift going from academia to entre like business.
Yeah.
So what was the adaptation like?
Well, yeah, I think like I said, I had a great people around me. So like I keep in touch with my PhD mentor, she's still my mentor to this day. Somebody I don't know, looked up to her a lot and how she dealt with people, how she managed. It's very different for sure, but some of the ways she developed technology, thought about how to like direct and lead groups of people. I think I modeled a lot of that her. And also my CEO, and he was really great, had a lot, had a great personality. We're still very close friends, learned a lot from him. So I think part of it surrounding yourself with other people that you can learn from, that are good, trust with people that that you like and want to be with. That ends up being the quickest way to sort of learn. And then, you're gonna make mistakes, but trusting those, try to do things for the right reason, I guess, and don't worry if you do make mistakes as long as they're not done, maliciously or something, and try to treat those bad things as, I guess, learning experiences. And part of the hardest part is just, yes, trying to, it's a gigantic roller coaster. So just trying to be around other people and have a kind of hope, I guess, or have that right support when you're in the difficult times is, I think, one of the things that, yeah, I got lucky to have really good people around me.
Yeah. And then the follow-up question is, if you could look back, maybe like 10, 20 years and give advice to your younger self, whether that's your undergrad years at U of I or grad school years at Stanford, even, beginning your entrepreneurship journey as you see through Nano, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Yeah, maybe don't freak out as much when things go bad. I think that's something you learn just with time. I think just the more problems you've had, and sometimes something small, now relatively small, I thought was the end of the world many times, and that as you sort of grow and or get older or whatever, or have more of those failures, you sort of realize, okay, the whole world didn't completely collapse. So I would just say, yeah, take that. That'd be advice to everybody is and let some things, yeah, like I said, I think one thing in the younger generation I see in general, I'm not saying necessarily good or bad. You guys are all great at being very structured, very ambitious, but also let some things just come to you. Have a little bit of fun. Find what you really like to do. Don't,
Yeah.
just yeah, those are, I think, good things. Just sometimes a lot of things just end up happening kind of for a reason, or really kind of call it. So don't try to force too much stuff, I guess, to be perfect, I guess.
Yeah. Well, U of I is a great place for fun. I can tell you that.
Yes, that's for sure. Yeah, four of the best years of my life for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that's all the questions I had, but if you want to share like any last advice or if there's anything that you're currently working on that you're excited about that we can spotlight, yeah.
No, I would just say the same thing. Have the fortune to talk to a lot of, I think, mostly engineers that are interested in entrepreneurship or interested, especially in materials, those kind of things. So I know it sounds like boring advice. It sounds like, eat your vegetables, but I really do think, focusing as an engineer on like the core fundamental principles of chemical engineering or physics, those things really pay dividends. All the problems we ended up solving to launch from this little idea to really a mass production product, we faced so many challenges along the way. And I had a very talented group of colleagues I worked with. But the way we all really solved those problems was really thinking about the fundamental core. What does this mean in terms of dynamics? What does it mean in kinetics? What are the real materials problems we're trying to solve? And so like the broader your strength and knowledge and how to adapt and think about those problems, I think like the greater success you can have. Because ultimately, if you're working in these spaces, you're always trying to solve something that's, contradictory, two opposing things. You want something that's really flexible and also, super scratch resistant, or you want something that's transparent and conductive. So there's always the balance. So the more you can think about those and just getting a stronger comfort and like kind of passion for things like physics or something just will help, I think, in all the other aspects of solving these kind of problems.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm actually getting a good taste of this in my research right now. Is
Okay, that's good.
making the contradictions work.
That's
So yeah. But yeah. Thank
great.
you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Jess. It was fun. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, go Illini.
Thank you. Go Alina as well. Do you still want to do the IO INI chant?
We can.
IO.
INI. All right. Embarrassing, yeah. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Have a good day. Take care.
Take care.
All right. Bye bye.